Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and so thankful for you to be with us today as we explore a topic that you're not hearing as much about as we need to hear about, and that is the fate of global poverty today and what's happening with the poorest of the poor in countries all over the world. It's a story we talk a lot about around Q Ideas. We have amazing partners that serve these communities all the time, and so many of you are involved in serving them. But this pandemic over the last 18 months has really created more chaos amongst this community. Those who were already suffering are now suffering more. And today we want to talk about what's taking place related to this last year. What are some of the changes that have happened? What can we learn from it? What are some of the frustrations around how we're going to solve some of these problems? And has this set us back? Have we lost years on when we could actually see the light at the end of the tunnel around ending global poverty? Well, I'm going to have with us Jordan Gustafson. He leads church mobilization and partnership efforts at Food for the Hungry. It's a global Christ-centered NGO that works in over 20 plus countries with the vision of seeing all forms of poverty ended through sustainable, holistic community development and disaster relief. So I'm looking forward to us digging into this conversation and learning more from Jordan. Let's welcome him in. Jordan, it's so great to have you on today. Thanks for being a part of the Q Ideas conversations.
Thank you so much, Gabe. It's great to be here, and we at Food for the Hungry love Q and are just excited to get to be a part of everything that God's doing through you all.
Well, we just love the work you guys have been doing. I mean, 50 years is a long time to faithfully, be pursuing this effort. A lot of changes happened in 50 years. And part of where I think our listeners are going to benefit today is just getting to hear a little more like on the ground what's happening today, because we know the world's changed significantly over the last 18 months. And in many ways, that's affected the most vulnerable. And oftentimes they never have a voice. They don't have a channel to kind of communicate it. And so that's why, Jordan, it was so important to have you today to just give us a little more of perspective on what's happening around the world. So let's just start there. Like, what's the state of global poverty today, 2021?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it's the right question that we need to ask so that we would have a deep understanding. I think one of the biggest things as we think about poverty globally and where we're at right now is just this understanding that in how we effectively define poverty will determine the way that we go about solving it. And so for us to have that deep understanding, for us to really begin to lean into the solutions, at the end of the day, it's been difficult over the last year and a half because we've seen so many of the global poverty statistics begin to shift. Things have been moving in such a positive direction in regards to to work around global poverty and not only meeting, but sustaining the needs that we see around the world. And we begin to see that change. And poverty is moving in a different direction. It's growing. It's not declining. And so as we understand it, we will solve it and we will jump into it. And so I think it's, again, particularly key for us to take a step back and to look at. I think one of the biggest things that we've seen over the course of the last year and a half has just been this needed shift immediately from long-haul development work back into the relief space and how we begin to meet needs specifically that present themselves. And so I know, in March 2020, when the pandemic was declared, there was just this immediate need everywhere, right? Between borders being closed down, people not being able to get from one space to the next, it just made things much more difficult to happen on an in-country perspective. And so it began the questions of, one, how do we meet what's there? And then two, how do we begin to move that into a place where we're able to begin to recover, begin to seek rehabilitation within specific communal spaces and countries all around the globe that are particularly under the weight of extreme poverty? And how do we begin to not only do things for, but to do things with, and ultimately to continue to transition that to local communities? And so one of the biggest things I would say as we're looking at global poverty and the issues that it presents to the world, it is how do we continue to pivot ourselves into a space where the solutions are coming from communities themselves, where solutions are coming from the countries in which these issues are particularly happening from. I think if we can begin to move back to the space of localization we have an opportunity to seek, again, not just the meaning of the moment, but really the meaning of it for good.
Right.
While all of this is happening kind of in real time in that sense of that sliding back. So I think it's important for us there.
So COVID changed things in the sense that your work was mostly ongoing development and it had to shift quickly back to relief. How do we get people who are starving this week
That's right.
food? And a lot of that's just due to supply lines, people not being able to operate the way that they were used to operating. Any other specific ways that you've seen COVID specifically in the pandemic disrupt kind of these countries? You guys serve over 20 different countries, some very large countries on multiple continents. What are the consistent themes that you're seeing that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I would say that the two biggest things as we've continued to look at the globe over the course of the last year and a half have been access to clean water. So again, not only is it available, but is it accessible to the people that are in need of it? And the other is income opportunities. So how are jobs being created and opportunities there? So many folks have to travel significant differences to be able to provide for their families. And in the midst of this, again, as we've seen such distance and isolation continue to be the reality, what it's done is it's continued to basically cease creating opportunities for individuals, and again, the needs only continue to grow in that space.
Yeah.
So I think it's one, the growing food insecurity, absolutely, but so many other things that contribute to that food insecurity. One of which being again that economic opportunity and that driver.
Yeah, it feels like if the Western countries have suffered a bit in their economies from the pandemic, and I'd like to say the government response to pandemic.
Yep.
Because I think we kind of easily go, oh, this is because of COVID, or it's just kind of out there. It's like, no, there's actually leaders making decisions based on their response to what is COVID and what is the appropriate response to it. So just to be clear, each of these countries, they have leaders. They're following obviously these larger bodies that have advice and sort of bring some sense of global authority, even though they don't really carry it. They kind of bring it to these conversations, but it influences a lot of these leaders, and their responses can hurt the poorest of the poor more than anybody, right? Because
That's right.
they're the ones with the least voice, the least agency to be able to make change. They're just kind of suffer under these consequences of leaders making decisions. And obviously, I think as time goes on, we'll keep looking back and going, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? And you can play a lot of armchair quarterback, but in the work you're doing, it is what it is.
That's correct.
There are people now that just don't have access, and you're trying to provide it. And I think your strategy that Food for the Hungry takes on is, how do we help create resilient communities? Could you talk a little bit more about what does that look like? I mean, what does that look like in South America? What does that look like in East Africa, where you have so much of your work, to build a resilient community today? What's a vision for that right now?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is we approach resilience and building resilient communities. I think, again, as we approach the last year and a half, we talk a lot about COVID, right? COVID gets the focus, and it should, don't get me wrong, in the midst of all of that. But honestly, everything else has continued to happen as well. So we have all of the vulnerable people of the world. And just because of COVID doesn't mean that natural disasters have stopped, doesn't mean that conflict has stopped. In fact, we've seen many increases of that as well across the globe. We've seen that increased food insecurity, which we talked about. There's been so many other challenges outside of COVID, and COVID's just been one more thing on top of. And so as we talk about, resilience and building resilient communities, it's for us having communities be able to be built up in a way where they have the ability to sustain and grow the impact that's happening within their spaces, and often, and even in our communities here across the U.S. or even in North America. And in the midst of adversity, how do we continue to sustain growth? How do we continue to sustain impact? And how do we, at the end of the day, continue to build up the systems and structures that are needed and focused ultimately in the right direction, being built upon the foundation that Christ has set before us, to continue on and to mitigate what could be on the other side of these disasters in which we're living in as it stands. And so a big piece of that, honestly, as it comes back to it, is the development of local leadership. It's the development of people. I think often we look at work globally, missions, we look at development work, and it's often, it comes back to projects, and we're focused on doing these things, and we're focused on accomplishing. But the biggest thing that we can be doing is building up people and building up ownership of a specific place and space for them to be able to say, we are able to respond in this moment faster, We're able to respond quicker. And at the end of the day, we're able to lead the way forward, even when what we've seen in COVID, the inability to get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And so again, it's preparing folks. It's understanding the risks that are and beginning to work in the meantime while you're addressing it to lower those immediately, but also to learn in that process for when that returns, to be able to know how to lean into that a bit quicker versus figuring out kind of on the spot. It's protecting people. And then it's also, in addition to that, it's equipping them at the end of the day to recover rapidly from those setbacks. And ultimately, again, it's the pouring into people. It's the building up of people. It's the pulling together of the community of Jesus, the body of Christ, to say, how do we lock arms? How do we lock our step for step, walking in step with the Spirit, to be able to, again, respond well, to walk together, to work together. So it's not I get mine and you get yours, but we collectively are able to press forward. And in the midst of the building up of a community, what can happen on the other side of that?
Yeah, I love the focus on local leaders. I mean, I think that's the point that we're learning is your local leadership matters. And whether you're in a village, in East Africa, or whether you're in a local city in a Western nation, whoever your town mayor is, whoever your county mayor is, your governor, all the further we go local, the more that's impacting lives. And there was such a long time where that wasn't the case. You didn't think about it much.
That's right.
Even if it was the case, it didn't have such an impact. And I think what you're describing is the future. It's how are we training up local leaders?
Yes.
How are we training them up in a world of information and misinformation to know what's true?
Yes.
To know how to discern. And, I was reading Neil Postman. He has this book called A Bridge to the 18th Century, where he talks a lot about our current culture has so much information, but we don't have knowledge. And when we just have information without knowledge, that's very confusing. But
yes,
beyond knowledge, we need wisdom.
That's right.
And wisdom is something you get from the ancient paths. It takes elders in a community. It takes those who've been around the block a bit, who can discern what's going on. And I would say as Christians, who have this opportunity to ask the Holy Spirit to help us, to see some things in the supernatural that's going on. And how are we going to lead and how are we going to respond? And so
yes,
I think the work Food for the Hungry is doing around the world. I mean, this is the work we got to do in the U.S. now, right?
That's right.
It's how do we build local networks, local communities, local leaders? We're doing that at Q Ideas. We've been pouring into local community leaders since we started our Q Commons effort back in 2014. We have hundreds of cities and leaders around the world who all are on the same page, who are working together to lead and help their communities flourish. And I just think 2021 is reminding us this is the work we have to get back to.
I think you're spot on too, Gabe, too, in the midst of that. I know we have a lot of pastors that are listening in as well. And I would say it's the same thing, as we approach, like you said, our own backyard here across the states. In that our pastors, our community leaders, they know their community better than anybody else, or they should, right? That's such an important piece of the ministry that we're called to our own backyard, is to be able to lead from that contextual space. And it's giving that opportunity, extending that opportunity, really seeing the developing world have the keys to say, we know our context, we know our people, we know what's present and what's not, but we have an idea of how that begins to build its way to press forward and to transform in the future.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that spot on, that's exactly what it is. But it's helping folks to have also, I think there's the ability that we have in relationship to help folks feel validated in the knowledge that they have of the space in which God's called them to live and to lead. And I think we have a lot of leaders, especially on the back end of what we've been experiencing, or even in the midst of what we're experiencing right now across the world, that are looking for that validation and looking to receive the validation of that calling, that God's called you to be here, and you know these people, you know this place,
right,
and you know the solutions there.
And Jordan, that's such an important message, because in a world today that's built off of kind of, I think it's Alistair McIntyre in his book After Virtue, he calls it, the bureaucratic expert. I forget how he says it, but he describes a world of bureaucracy where we rely on experts for everything to tell us what to do today, to think how to think about this, how to think about that. You almost lose this sense of empowerment as a human being who God's designed to function in this world. And I'd imagine in these communities that you're working with, you're seeing what that collective wisdom looks like when just a bunch of human beings come together and sit in a circle.
That's exactly right.
And they talk, and they're like, okay, we can figure this out. We don't have to wait for the information to come down from on high to tell us how to help sustain our community. God's given us like this amazing palette, right?
Yes.
Or I know in some of your work, talk a little bit about the gardens and the importance of this idea you've mentioned of how people grow their impact, sustain and grow their impact. I mean, that comes down to literal food, right? I mean,
That's right.
you're trying to help these communities not just wait for USAID to show up, but to actually know how to build that into their community infrastructure.
Yep. But you're spot on in that. And again, I think it comes back down to this idea we look at, again, global work specifically from that relief space, the rehabilitation to development. At the end of the day, instead of moving something from point A to point B, what if that can already be built in and present in a specific space, in a community, that a family has the opportunity to, one, learn and grow in their skills in the ways that can support them, not only from a personal perspective, but even from an income perspective later on, but also meet the immediate need that there is from their family. And so one of the biggest things that we've been able to do in the midst of the pandemic has been able to train and to teach and to provide opportunities for folks to have their own gardens, to grow their own food, and to ultimately have a sustainable plot to be able to engage and to take care of their family. And not only their family, but their neighbor and their neighbor's neighbor, et cetera. And that ultimately begins to be built across a community. When you see a body of people who have this ability, who have again, been given, like you mentioned, Gabe, this knowledge, and then on top of that, the wisdom in which how to steward it and to use it. Because ultimately, that's the conversation, right? It's a stewardship conversation. But how do we use this, again, not only to meet what's existent, but to help those and serve those around us in building that community, and ultimately to provide something that lasts significantly longer than ultimately just, again, one thing that's being given to an individual? What if that thing has the ability to recreate and recreate and recreate, and ultimately that would last significantly longer than hopefully this pandemic will be lasting around our globe as well.
Yeah, one of my favorite talks at our recent Culture Summit was called Food as Freedom.
Yeah.
And it was a whole talk around this idea of when people have access to food, they have freedom.
That's
and
right.
When you look around the world and you see tyranny or authoritarianism moving in, it's usually on a people that don't have the ability to supply for themselves or to
That's right.
sustain their way of life. They've become so reliant on their local government or their officials that they don't know how to do that. And I think this is a new lesson for humanity: is how do we sustain ourselves, and who are we relying on, and who can we trust? And so who would have thought we'd have had a conversation like that 5 years ago as you were doing all this great development work? But I think that some things are just becoming more clear for people about how do we live? How are we going to survive together? How do we help one another?
That's right.
As you look at this decade, and you're in the rooms with a lot of these other humanitarian organizations who are just thinking about, the conversation's been for many years, like, we can end global poverty. It's within reach. I mean, is that something that, as you do your work, you guys are seeing that? Did the pandemic set us back a decade? I mean, I feel like we were seeing the light at the end of the tunnel based on the strategies and the good work that so many people are doing to end global poverty. But where do we sit now, and did that get adjusted?
Yeah, I think we're in the midst of that. We've definitely been set back, as I mentioned, just with a number of the goals as we've been looking forward to 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals of the globe. Things have been moving in a negative direction, and COVID's definitely set us back significantly. But I would say in the midst of that, there has been significant hope. I think there is an opportunity right now to reapproach again how we are looking at the problem, how we are solving the problem. I think there's an opportunity right now to welcome innovation in a way that I don't think has necessarily been pursued as it is right now. And I think there's a sweetness that comes in the midst of that. One of the things I would say in the midst of that, I know we talk a lot about, again, solutions and people at the end of the day coming together. But the thing that I've been the most blown away by is the hope that I see in all of our brothers and sisters around the world that are living in situations of extreme poverty. I think, again, as we look at poverty specifically and how we define it, it really, really begins to shift the way that we look at the world. And one of the things I've seen is that even in the midst of COVID and in the midst of difficulty, so much more difficulty than I would say we've experienced here, is immense hope, is immense possibility to the future, is not been this opportunity to take a step back, but instead to take a step in. And there has been such an openness on a spiritual level to seeking Jesus and to receiving Jesus and to beginning to address not only felt needs and physical needs of an individual, but at the end of the day, the whole person and how God's designed us to be as his people in the midst of that. And so there's amazing hope. And I think that there are so many solutions that are beginning to come out of, again, communities. And so as I look at the next 10 years, do I think we have a lot of work in front of us? Absolutely. Have steps been taken back in many ways? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there immense hope? I think there is. And I've seen that really, truly, personally with my own eyes and in my own conversations. And it's that hope that again, ultimately will be the thing that begins to and continues to press forward. And I know as we look to scripture, specifically Colossians 1:19 and 20 comes to my mind particularly. And it says that, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile himself to all things, whether things on earth, things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And at the end of the day, that's our hope.
Yeah.
That's what we're in. And God's invited us, right, into an opportunity to join him in the renewal, into that reconciliation. And that happens at a whole person level. And this is where we have our hope. This is where it comes from. And this is where we need to continue to urge people to turn in the midst of this moment to say, yes, through this hope, we will see much physical improvement. We will see many physical needs be met. We will see that happen sustainably, and we will continue to press forward. But it is not our hope within that, but it's our hope within Jesus, and which fuels it. And that's the key.
Yeah.
And that's the key for every one of us.
Yeah, that's right, Jordan. And thanks for bringing it back to that and just reminding us of how much we can trust that God's in the midst of reconciling us and communities and the whole world to himself. Final thoughts from you as you talk to a mostly Western audience. Yep. And you work all around the world, and you're serving people that many times are not enjoying the comforts, the leisure, the types of lifestyles that many in the West have just become so accustomed to. And some of them are struggling because they're seeing that change and they're not sure what the next few years are going to look like. What encouragement would you bring to a leader in the West from these different places, these different villages, these different communities who've learned to live differently and in many times with a lot more joy and less mental health issues? I mean, Let's be honest.
Amen.
What is it that we need to learn from our neighbors around the world?
Yeah, I think so much of it, it's that true joy and the genuine happiness, that joy that we see that comes from Jesus ultimately is not dependent upon a physical condition. I think one of the things we often say in conversation with folks is that, often we in the West, we're so poor, all that we have is money. And I think it's so key. We always invite folks in, ultimately at the end of the day, if you go into a situation and you attempt to see poverty, you attempt to see a lack of material good, you will see it. It will be present. It will be there. But if you go in and you are looking for wealth and you are looking for the riches that are there, my goodness gracious, it far exceeds anything that I've ever experienced in my life here in the U.S. And it's just the reality of it. I think as we look at it particularly, again, physical goods, material possessions, those are not the things that will buy our happiness. Again, comfort for sure on the other end of it, but relationships are such a fuel to life and a fuel to joy, first and foremost coming from that relationship with Jesus and from our God, and outside of that then beginning to stem into our brothers and sisters and who God's created in his image, much like he has each one of us.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I would say to folks as well as we begin to jump forward is, one, there's never been a better time to lean in. There's never been a better time to jump into the work that God is doing around the world and even in our own backyards as well. And so this is our moment. This is our moment as the church, as God's people, to be able to jump in and to lean forward. And my encouragement for each and every one of us would be to take an internal would look very deep at the way in which we approach poverty, the way in which we view poverty, and that often we would be able to identify within us that we've had a mistaken focus, a mistaken identity of which our roles in it, a mistaken motivation in how we enter into it. And often that has leaned itself towards a mistaken response. And we have the opportunity right now in this kind of equalizing moment to name some of that and to begin to shift some of that and to begin to move into places where we can, again, walk hand in hand as at the end of the day, God's community around the globe, and that we would seek collective thriving all around the world. So that's my encouragement for everybody.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, Jordan. And this is your 50-year anniversary. I mean, with Food for the Hungry, and people listening can learn more about them at fh.org, where you can learn how to get involved with them. what I love is humanitarian organizations that have been around for a long time because they know the relationships, the network, how to get things done on the ground. And you guys are doing that every day around the world. So keep up the good work. We love you guys. And thanks for offering some great insights to just help us as we navigate this particular year.
Thanks so much, Gabe. Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot, just like I did, on some of the ways that Jordan is communicating back to us from the field, really. Like, these are the things we need to learn. These are the things we can take away. And so I'd encourage you, again, go to fh.org. You can learn so much more about how they're working to end all forms of human poverty. It is their 50-year anniversary, which is so fun and exciting to celebrate institutions that have faithfully done their work this long and for such a time as this, and so we're grateful for them. I also want to tell you about an exciting new development that we've been working on this summer at Q Ideas for you as leaders, and it's called the Collaborative. We're going to have 100 leaders have the opportunity over the next 8 months to learn together, to grow together, to read together, to discuss all these difficult, controversial, sometimes issues that are being censored in certain places, and spaces where you don't always know how to have this off-the-record conversation, where you can ask the questions that you really want to know, and you can get real answers. And so what we're doing is convening this incredible group of leaders, people that you've trusted before, who've been a part of our Q Ideas Culture Summits and other events, mentors, people who are trusted in these spaces, to talk about with you some of the issues affecting all of us. We're going to be dealing with topics such as polarization. We're going to talk about sexuality, technology. We're going to dig into a lot of these conversations about where's the world going right now. So many pastors and leaders that I've talked to in recent weeks are declaring they feel alone. They feel they don't know how to respond to certain topics and issues. They're trying to lead congregations. They're trying to lead people in their company, their teams, their family. And there's a lot of confusion and chaos. I don't think that's by accident. I think the enemy loves that kind of chaos. But what we want to do is we want to confront that by creating space for you as a leader to go deeper and be a part of the collaborative with us, this 8-month journey where we're going to learn together. Every month I'll be interviewing a panel of experts. We'll be taking your questions. You'll be able to learn and listen virtually. You'll also, every other week, be able to gather with a smaller group within this cohort of 25 that allows you to build relationships and friendships with those who are in like-minded work, who are maybe a pastor if you're a pastor, or maybe they're a business leader or leading in culture somewhere, or maybe they're younger generation coming out of college in their 20s trying to navigate this new world. We're going to be right there with you. You're not alone. You don't need to do this alone. You don't need to be in isolation. You can do this in community. And so kicking off September 30th in Franklin, Tennessee, all of those who are participating in that have the opportunity to gather in person, to see each other face to face, to begin this by kicking it off together. And then we'll go through those 8 months together. And then at the end, we'll come together April 28th and 29th at our Culture Summit, which is all included in the collaborative experience. And so learn more at qideas.org/cohort. So qideas.org/cohort. You can learn all about it, see who the presenters are, all the people that we're bringing together, the topics, the questions we'll be asking. Every month there'll be a new book that you'll have the opportunity to read together with this group. This certainly isn't meant to add weight to your life in the sense of more time and more commitment, but it's meant to give you space to think well about this cultural moment. That's what we've been called to do, and we want to help you do that well in this year ahead. So join us, qideas.org/cohort. We'll kick this off in late September, but at this point, make sure you get your registration in as we're becoming much more limited on space. So we hope you'll join us now.